Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about psychosis and ADHD. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can type them in and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation I think will be on the shorter side, so certainly less than 20 minutes. This will also be posted on YouTube and Facebook Live. And without further ado, I'm going to jump into psychosis and ADHD. So I'm going to start by talking about, so what is psychosis? We throw it around as a term both colloquially and we use it frequently in mental health fields, and lots of definitions are not in complete 100% agreement, but in general, psychosis describes people who are having trouble with reality testing. So they have trouble evaluating what is real and what is not real. This may include hallucinations, where people are getting or imagining, creating, whatever word you want to use, perceptions that don't correlate with what's in the external reality. Those can be auditory hallucinations, that can be visual hallucinations where they're seeing things that aren't there. That can be smells, so olfactory, even tactile hallucinations can exist. You don't have to have hallucinations to have psychosis. Another common, but again, each individual piece is not necessary in itself. Delusions are another common manifestation of psychosis, and the commonest definition of delusion is having an unrelenting sense of certainty that is being maintained despite strong contradictory evidence. So often we classify these depending on paranoia, if someone's worried about their being harmed or pursued or followed. There can be other forms of delusions. And it does not matter how many other people are believing in delusions. So there's a certain political party in America right now which is rampantly overrun with delusional individuals. Because they're having an unrelenting sense of certainty that's maintained despite strong contradictory evidence. So even though a cultural group can certainly hold a delusion, 300 years ago, maybe I should say 400, most people thought the world was flat. The world is not flat. There's a small number of people holding that delusion now, but there is a majority of people holding it, but it is a delusional belief. Other aspects of psychosis include, or can include, incoherent or disorganized speech. Many people, particularly with schizophrenia, which is probably the classic presentation of psychosis, also have potentially intellectual deficits and or social deficits. So what are the causes of schizophrenia? So most common and most often described classic cases of psychosis are schizophrenia, so a mental health condition whose central feature is psychosis. Mania can also be part of bipolar disorder. People in a full-blown manic episode are often psychotic, but you don't have to be psychotic to have full-blown mania. Sleep deprivation can cause psychosis. So if you are kept awake long enough, you will start seeing things that aren't there. You will start believing and thinking things that aren't there. And in terms of instances rather than permanent states, certainly intoxication states are the most common cause of psychotic episodes. So alcohol would be in our society the number one, just because it's how prevalent it is. Certainly other drugs, like people freaking out on cocaine or speed, stimulants commonly do it. Marijuana can do it. It's not nearly as commonly as these other drugs, but given that so many people are now consuming marijuana. And there's certainly other toxins that can cause psychosis. Classically, mercury poisoning, which is what made the Mad Hatter mad, and other toxins can cause psychotic states. So what's the connection between ADHD and psychosis? There have been a lot of different studies that have noted some increased prevalence of psychosis in individuals with ADD, and a recent, just a few months ago, meta-analysis that was published in a well-respected journal, JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association Psychiatry version, performed a meta-analysis which included more than 1.8 million patients. 15 studies were reviewed in this analysis, and 12 were included in their data analysis. And their findings, so they were looking at children who were diagnosed with ADHD and looked at how many of them grew up or developed a psychotic disorder later in life. And the number was pretty close to 5 times as many children who had ADHD developed a psychotic disorder in adulthood compared to youngsters who went through their childhood without any ADHD. And in this study, whether it was full-blown schizophrenia or other forms of psychotic disorders, and we have what's called psychosis NOS, meaning it's not otherwise specified, where we can't quite sort it out or declare it as officially schizophrenia. These dozen studies were conducted in different ways, and the same general result of about a 5-fold increase in psychosis came up regardless of how the studies were designed or conducted. So to put that in perspective, in the general population, and studies do vary somewhat, but schizophrenia and related severe full-blown psychotic disorders, about 1% of the population develop those sometime during their lifespan. So that would suggest that about 5% of kids with ADHD go on to develop psychotic disorders. So good news, 95% of people won't develop that with ADHD, but 5% is not trivial, particularly for something this severe and this disabling. Some people, when they saw this topic I was going to be talking about, brought up, well, maybe this is all just a result of people's having bad responses to medications. Aren't these stimulants horrible things that make people psychotic and crazy? And I have a presentation earlier in this series, you can go look it up, where I talk in depth about amphetamine-induced psychosis. However, even though currently the sort of the worst case scenario there is that only about 1 out of 500 children or adults taking amphetamine-based products, Adderall and others, develop a psychotic disorder or have a psychotic episode. And only a fraction of those who have the psychotic episode go on to have a permanent psychotic disorder. But results so far, when we've tried to look more closely for Ritalin, methylphenidate products are even lower and potentially comparable to the background rate, so there may not be any increase in psychosis with Ritalin methylphenidate products. But again, if that 1 out of 500 number is valid, that would suggest that only 0.2% of people with taking the stimulants develop their psychosis from that reason. And again, the numbers crunched come out to pretty close to 5% of people with ADHD. So we cannot simply explain this away as all amphetamine-induced psychosis. So why would there be an increased likelihood of psychosis in ADHD? One is, in contrast to what we were thinking or finding 5, 10, 15 years ago, when there were early genetic studies showing, there were much ballyhooed studies showing that in one group of people with ADHD, we could see different genetic variants of certain dopamine receptors or transporter molecules. It is very clear, and from that people have concluded erroneously, a simple genetic variation and as part of the dopamine system is what causes ADHD. Clearly not the case. Clearly an oversimplification. Clearly not what we see in general ADHD. What we see is hundreds, if not thousands, of genes, each contributing a tiny, tiny propensity or predisposition to ADHD. And the more we look at this, the more it appears that there is vast, extensive overlap between these genes that predispose towards ADHD and the same general group of genes predisposing towards depression, towards schizophrenia, towards a whole host of other conditions. This is not a mainstream thought, but there are certainly some scientists, researchers who have spent some time on that who are thinking maybe we should essentially say we have one mental health condition because the genetic profiles are so, and again, the hundreds of thousands of variants of genes that are contributing to this propensity have such overlap among the different mental health conditions that maybe we're really looking at one underlying mental health condition which does have different patterns or manifestations of it. I'd say the whole field hasn't gone that far yet, but there's a huge shared genetic load or genetic predisposition between schizophrenia and ADHD, or between depression and ADHD. Maybe that's part of what's going on. Particularly with schizophrenic disorders and other psychotic disorders, it's dopaminergic systems that have been implicated. So all of our old antipsychotic medications, things like thorazine and chlorpromazine, Haldol, Navane, others, were strong dopamine 2 receptor blockers. And we also know that there is strong involvement of dopamine systems in ADHD. And again, often we simplify things for popular consumption, and the thought, and I've seen reports saying, schizophrenia is too much dopamine and ADHD is not enough dopamine. It's not that simple, but disruption of dopamine pathways, neuropharmacology, are probably having an important, if not central, role in both ADHD and schizophrenia, so it's not that surprising that we might see an overlap or a higher proportion of people with ADHD developing psychotic disorders. We also know, not just in the genetic and not just the biochemical realm, that there's a whole host of, we call them insults or traumas or disruptions that can occur during pregnancy, that including just prematurity itself, which seems to increase the likelihood that an infant will develop either ADHD or schizophrenia. And there's some correlative work suggesting maybe more strongly for psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia, that socioeconomic and cultural factors may push people in that direction, and lesser degree some of that may be influencing or determining genetically susceptible individuals, which of those develop ADHD as well. And one additional hypothesis I'm putting forward, and I don't know how important this might be, but I think there may be an artifactual dimension to this, so that if you had a psychotic disorder, but knew that people would consider it strange or weird or odd, you might want to try to conceal it or hide it. But if you have ADHD, you may have more trouble hiding it. So maybe some part of the elevated rate of psychosis among those with ADHD is simply less ability to hide socially unacceptable, bizarre, unusual, strange thoughts, because people with ADHD have problems with impulse control. So again, we don't know the full range of reasons why this may be so. Again, it could be some common origin, common factors contributing both to psychosis and ADHD. Unlike where ADHD clearly predisposes because people fit in less well with academic patterns and social norms and other things, so people with ADHD break those more often, run into more societally defined failures, and that may well be a contribution to higher rates of depression. And certainly there's an overlap between ADHD and anxiety, and again, some of that is if your brain works a little differently, you are treated a little differently, and you may become more self-conscious about that. It's harder to see how the features of ADHD itself would lead to higher rates or result in psychosis itself. So nobody's currently attributing that as the strong connection between the two of them. So that is about all I have to say. I can see one question, which I will read in a second. And The next Friday at 11 talk is going to be on guanfacine and ADHD. Guanfacine, a extended release version of it, is FDA approved as Intuitive for treating ADHD, and although this was approved almost a decade ago, there's been a sort of increased and growing awareness of what place guanfacine may have in treating ADHD and how it may have advantages or complement some of our more traditional stimulant-like medications. So the question I see is, can you talk about how schizophrenia is often misdiagnosed with amphetamine-induced psychosis, please? So, I mean, by definition, schizophrenia involves psychotic symptoms. So again, often hallucinations, often delusions, often deficits in or decreases in from a baseline of intellectual performance and social functioning. The most common pattern of schizophrenia is that although intellectual and social withdrawal symptoms actually start earlier, maybe in early to mid-adolescence, the most common presentation of schizophrenia is starting in late adolescence, even early young adulthood. And by definition, it's an ongoing state, although there may be exacerbation, it may wax and wane in severity. By definition, amphetamine-induced psychosis is a result of consuming amphetamines. And again, I have a whole other 20-minute talk on this at different parts of stored here as well, so you can go look it up in detail. So with amphetamine-induced psychosis, we know, one, that street stimulants, cocaine, speed, methamphetamine, have a much higher likelihood of triggering it than our prescription stimulants, but certainly Adderall, which is a combination of dextroamphetamine and levoamphetamine, has a risk for inducing amphetamine-induced psychosis. Many people also call the amphetamine-induced psychosis amphetamine-induced mania. So classically, amphetamine-induced psychosis isn't just paranoid delusions, but it also almost always involves rapid speech, decreased need for sleep, increased energy, increased expression. Unlike pure mania or more amphetamine-induced psychosis doesn't necessarily centrally have an increased sense of self and a grandiosity. And again, mania itself in bipolar disorder can be primarily sort of positive, full of oneself, overexcited, over-inflated ego state. So what all the cases I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them of amphetamine-induced psychosis, it's very, paranoid psychosis is central to it. Hyperactivity, decreased need for sleep, and again, with amphetamine-induced psychosis, that is not just an intoxication state, so it can exist or persist for days, weeks, months after the medication, after the stimulant has left someone's body, after the amphetamine. And recent studies, and we don't have huge exhaustive amounts of data, suggest though that if you look 10, 20 years out after a single episode of amphetamine-induced psychosis, it may look exactly like schizophrenia. So it may be indistinguishable. So in some proportion of these people, it is going on to a full-blown schizophrenic-like state. So I hope that answered the question. Again, I will be posting this online in a few minutes, and it will be on YouTube as well later. So have a safe and sane week in a strange world. I'll be back next week.